So I'm a trans person in my 30s, and this is my transition story. This is a video I've been meaning to make for a while. Now seems like a good a time as any. And I've actually made a version of it before, back when I was like 18 years old. I basically did this like slideshow of pictures of myself from like childhood to adolescence with just like text on the screen talking about like when I first questioned my identity and how I came out to my family and all the blowout that came from there. And I threw it on YouTube not really expecting anything, and it actually got a lot of attention. It was one of my first experiences kind of going viral with one of my videos. And this was way back in the day, like 2008, 2009. So YouTube was a little different back then. And it ended up being seen by some of my extended relatives, which is kind of how I came out to them, which is a bit tricky. But it also got a lot of like positive comments and support, and I got a lot of really nice messages. And it's actually kind of a reason I'm still doing content creation now. That story has since been like scrubbed from the internet because I like just don't need any of my old content floating around, but I'm ready to revisit it from a bit of a fresh perspective. I'm going to start way back with when I was a child and first questioning my identity, because in many ways I was a very classic like trans case where like my grandmother has a story from when I was 5 years old telling her I feel like a boy and nobody can tell, and she basically was like, that's cool, go play, which like, yeah, she didn't know what to do with that information. I also had a friend around the ages like 5 to 10 with whom I constantly played this game that I was this alien prince who had been disguised as a human girl and sent to live on Earth. But at night I became myself again. Big trans feelings. And I like have a lot of memories around that age of, I guess, signs that I was questioning, but really like I actually had a pretty good sense of who I was and how I felt. And mostly I was curious why nobody else could see it. And I tried telling the other boys and girls my age, like who I was, but I mean, they didn't really understand it either. But we played together nicely enough until I was around like 8 or 9 years old. And then I remember this sort of shift happening where the boys I was friends with didn't want to be friends with me because I was a girl, no matter what I told them otherwise. And the girls that I was friends with started forming their own sort of little cliques and getting into their girlhood in a way I just didn't really understand. I remember distinctly thinking, I don't feel like either a boy or a girl the way these people do, and I don't know where I belong. I ended up making friends with some of the weird girls, which love me a weird girl. A lot of them grew up to be like trans, queer, non-binary, or just alternative. And for a while I was kind of making it work, but then my life turned upside down again. And my parents announced they were getting divorced. And by grade 6, I was starting over entirely in a new neighborhood, a new school. My parents were living in separate houses. I was going back and forth between them as they had shared custody. My mom was getting remarried to a guy who had his own kid, and everything was different. But I tried to take this as an opportunity. At my new school, I decided I was going to be a proper girl. I got into makeup and feminine clothing, and yeah, it kind of felt like drag, but like, I don't know, maybe that's just how it's supposed to feel. Yeah, I struggled to fit in with my peers, partially because I also had undiagnosed and untreated ADHD. But I was making it work okay. But secretly, I was still very much thinking about being a boy. And I was really fascinated with stories about girls becoming boys. Like, I watched Mulan obsessively and just crying over the reflection scene, being like, why does this resonate with me? I used to stay up late and watch episodes of Cyber 6, which, if you know, you know. Such a classic series. And I was really into Danny Phantom, which I know is not about gender, but the whole Secret Life as a Ghost thing really spoke to me. And in fact, I remember I used to pray that God would turn me into Danny Phantom, that I would wake up as Danny Phantom, which, like, yeah. I was also very religious. My grandfather's a minister. I went to church every Sunday. I went to Christian camp in the summertime. I prayed before bed every night. I was in it. And I didn't really see like these questions about my gender to be at odds with my Christianity. I didn't even really think of them as connected. If anything, I was a little worried that God wouldn't love that I was bisexual, because I was figuring that out around like ages 12, 13, 14, and I was starting to crush on girls and boys alike. But I kind of figured, like, if God made me bi, that must be fine then, right? Like, how could that be wrong? And thankfully, I was, like, involved with pretty progressive Christians. They were, like, pretty liberal. But I do actually have distinct memories of liking boys and girls, but in a boy way. Specifically, I was very interested in gay boys and crushing on gay boys. There was, like, one openly gay kid at my school, and I have these like journal entries where I was drawing pictures of if we went on a date and how I would put my arm around him and all this little stuff. And even the girls that I liked, like, I mean, I didn't know any girls who were interested in dating someone like me, but my fantasies were very much like being their boyfriend. I didn't really know how to square that in my head, but I thought maybe this is just what it's like for bi kids, bi people like me. And I started looking for media about like queer stories, especially gay men, right? And I got into the world of webcomics, where there are a lot of stories about boys falling in love with other boys. Specifically, I read this webcomic called Boy Meets Boy. I would read it obsessively, stay up late, like on the family computer, reading page after page after page. And the author of that comic had a series of like recommended comics that they liked. And one of them was called Venus Envy, which was about a trans girl. This was my first time ever coming across a story about a trans person that wasn't like, you know, very sensationalist. Like all the narratives I'd ever seen were about like trans women who were either dangerous or pitiful or the butt of a joke. But here was this very humanizing story about a trans girl my age. There was also a trans guy character and a non-binary character. And I was like, oh, that's what I've been feeling. Instantly, I knew. And I was like elated that there was a word for how I'd been feeling, but I was also terrified. And I began researching concepts like dysphoria. And I realized, oh, that's that feeling I've been having where I look in the mirror and I see myself and I'm like pretty and intelligent and I'm like capable in all the ways I know girls can be. And yet I have this fundamental feeling like something is wrong. And okay, this is what this thing is. And I joined a forum for trans people and started connecting with some. And again, they just turned out to be like people, nothing like the caricatures I'd seen on TV. Most of them were adults who were transitioning and they were talking about what the medical side of transition looked like. But there were some teenagers as well. In fact, there was a trans girl in my area, like just in the next town over. And we made plans to meet up sometime. And I started privately imagining what it would be like to openly live as a boy. I started stealing my dad's clothes and getting dressed up in my room. I started binding with a scarf that I found, which I do not recommend. I picked a name, just like a good little Christian kid. I wanted to either be Mark or John. I picked Mark. Here we are. And I came out to a few of my friends, and I even started going to the local LGBTQ center and meeting up with queer and trans youth my own age. I started seeing a counselor there, and I even wrote a coming out letter to my parents because I knew that they were not going to be thrilled about this. The bi thing had been rocky, and they did not like when I made friends with people on the internet. That had been a big point of tension between us. And this was kind of like taking all of that to the next level. But I wrote a coming out letter, and I even had like a Q&A section where I was like, imagining they might ask me, but you date boys, like, you know, and then I'd say, well, gender and sexuality are different, something like that. And I put it under my pillow, and I was going to come out to them the next day. I decided. And then when I woke up, it was Sunday morning, my mom came in my room to get me ready for church, and she said, we know. We went through your internet history. I'd forgotten to scrub it. And she found all this stuff, all this trans stuff. And she told me that I had to cut it out. That every time I told someone I was a boy, I was lying to them. That asking people to use my chosen name and pronouns was forcing them to partake in my lie. That after church that day, they would take all of my masculine clothes and they would throw them out and buy me a whole new feminine wardrobe. And this whole thing would be over. If I really had to be bi or gay or whatever, I could do that, but I wasn't doing this trans thing. And I don't remember how I reacted. I just remember feeling like numb and frozen. Somehow I convinced them not to make me go to church that day. And while they were gone, I took all of the clothes they were going to throw out, put them in a garbage bag, brought them to my friend's house and hid them. And when I came back, my mom, my stepdad, and my father were all there, and they were ready to confront me. And they basically told me that I had been brainwashed by these people on the internet, which is interesting because that's the language still a lot of people use. Around like transness and how, you know, there's this big trans cult that's changing our children or whatever. And this was all in like the 2007, 2008. So that line's been around for a while. And they made it very clear that if I didn't cut all of this trans stuff, I was going to set myself up for a lifetime of trouble. They said I probably wouldn't finish high school. I definitely wouldn't go to university. I'd probably struggle to find employment. I'd fall in with a bad crowd. I certainly wouldn't find anybody who'd be willing to date me or love me, and I'd probably be dead in a ditch before I was 30. And the sad thing is that stuff, like, trans people do struggle with. We do struggle with employment, education, finding, like, love and community. But the factors around that are not our transness, they are our level of acceptance. Those of us who are accepted and supported by our family tend to have really positive outcomes, at least on par with our peers. But they did not recognize that they were actually the ones setting me up for that hardship. They thought they were saving me. And I did try to tell them, like, I'm not looking to medically transition tomorrow. I'm willing to wait till I'm an adult. But I am feeling this very strong need to socially transition. This feels like something I have to do. And I even told them it feels like something God is telling me to do, because I'd had these moments of, like, total clarity when I'd been praying and praying and praying on this. I had a sense that this was the path God wanted me to walk down. And look, I'm not Christian anymore, but I still believe that those moments were real. But my parents just couldn't hear it. They just couldn't understand. And they made it very clear that I was not going to live in their house and do any of this stuff. And I didn't have anywhere else to go. So I did go back in the closet. They even got me to write an email to all of my online friends telling them to never contact me again, that they had brainwashed me, and now I was finally waking up and I was going to go back to being a normal girl. Which was, of course, a lie. Like, the moment I could, I got to an internet cafe and I wrote to all those same friends and I said, hey, sorry, my parents made me say all that. They had a really bad reaction when I came out. And my friends online were relieved, although they were also scared for me. And I began to kind of just live a double life. Because that's the thing when you try to restrict your children and, like, try to stop us from experimenting with who we are, we just get sneakier about it. I continued to sneak out to the LGBTQ center, and when they figured out I was doing that and cut me off from that, I started sneaking out at night and going to party with, like, people who probably were not safe to be around, but made me feel like myself. I started secretly getting dressed at my friend's house before going to school and then changing back into my girl clothes when going home. I started secretly hanging out with that trans girl who lived in the next town over. I met her friend who was a trans guy, one of the first trans guys I ever met my own age, and we secretly started dating. I even introduced him to my family as a cis guy, and they bought it for like 3 months. Shortly after my 17th birthday, they kind of figured everything out, that I had been hiding all this stuff from them, and that, like, my boyfriend was, in fact, another trans guy. And I remember my stepdad's face. He just looked like his brain was exploding. And he was like, you're lesbians who want to be gay men? And I was like, yeah, kinda. They were furious. They demanded I recloset myself. But this time I just couldn't do it anymore. And after a month of fighting back and forth, I just decided that was enough. There was a girl at school. She'd been kicked out for being a teen mom. She needed a babysitter. And she said that I could come and live with her in exchange for being, like, an in-house nanny. And that's where I decided to go. And after one particularly bad fight with my mom, where she said, if you hate it here so much, why don't you just leave? I said, fine, I will. I grabbed my stuff and I left. I spent a week at my dad's. He told me I could stay with him, but he still didn't support this, like, medical transition stuff I wanted to do when I was 18. And I was like, you know what? I'm already gone. Like, I was so ready at that point. I don't know if there was anything he could have said to make me stay other than just complete 100% support. And he told me the morning I moved out that if I left that day, that I was never coming back. I would not be welcome. So I hid my stuff in the garage. And after school, I went back, and indeed I found that he had hired a locksmith to change the locks. So that was it. I was completely on my own. And leaving home was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Like, I talk about it now, but at the time, I was devastated. Because it wasn't just my parents I was cutting contact with. I had siblings, and I had pets. I had a whole life, and I didn't know what was going to happen to me next. I remember writing in my journal that I felt like an emotional orphan. Like, there was nobody there for me in the world. And that guy I was dating, the trans guy, we didn't last that long after the move out. So I was totally alone. The only point of contact I had with my parents was that they paid for me to go see a psychologist who specialized in gender identity disorder. She told them I fit the criteria for it, and then they stopped paying for that. So, anyways. And all of this happened while I was in grade 11. at school, which you can imagine was not great for my grades or my social life. But I honestly felt like my parents were probably right. I was probably going to die before I was 30. My grades were going in the toilet just like they had predicted. I might as well just live as myself and just sort of go hard and fast in life, you know? But I did still want to be a good kid. And I wanted to like get good grades and live like kind of a normal life. So I walked to school every day, and I kept trying to make it to my classes and do my homework. And one day, while I was walking, my grandmother pulls up in her car. And keep in mind, I haven't seen my grandparents in a good while. I never came out to them because my parents told me that it would like devastate them, like, you know, that I'd give them a heart attack. And here I am walking with like a shaved head. I've got like a fake nose ring in, a big bulky jacket. My grandmother recognizes me, pulls over, and she says, "Hey, do you need a ride?" She gives me a ride to school. She told me that she's been looking for me. She's been wondering what's been going on. My parents won't tell her why I left or why we're not talking. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to be rejected again, but I eventually told her the truth, that I felt like a boy and my parents didn't understand. Turns out she actually knew a trans guy at work. She was a nurse, and there was a trans guy at the hospital. She said, "Look, I don't get it, but we love you. And if you need a safe place to go, you are always welcome with us." I ended up taking them up on it. At the end of grade 11, I moved in with them. And I started to live in their basement. And they even drove me to the LGBTQ center so that I could keep going to my little support groups. They let me have my queer and trans friends over for like game nights and stuff. They helped me with my grades. My grandfather was a teacher, and like, this is my mom's parents, not the minister. And he tutored me, and he had ADHD as well. He recognized it in me, and he helped me sort of manage it. And I started actually doing better. By grade 12, my grades had picked up, my relationships with my peers had improved, and I started feeling just like kind of a normal kid again. I even got a scholarship to the University of Winnipeg, but I didn't end up being able to really use it because I was busy working like 2 jobs. And even though my grandparents were super supportive and affirming, I really wanted to be on my own. So I moved out the fall following my graduation from high school. And that psychologist I'd seen through my parents, I paid her for a few sessions, but she was pretty nervous about referring me to an endocrinologist and sort of rubber stamping my transition. I think she was pretty scared about what my parents would do even after I turned 18. But I heard through the grapevine that there was a walk-in clinic in town where if you went for 3 different appointments, on your 3rd appointment, the doctor would give you hormones. So I started going to the walk-in clinic, and I managed to get on testosterone that way. And I was living in my own place, paying my own rent. And a month shy of 19, I did my first T-shot. And I did it myself because I went to a nurse to get it done, and she said she didn't understand how that stuff worked. And I was also trying to save money for top surgery. This is part of why I was working so much, because transition surgeries were not covered in Manitoba at the time. I was actually part of sort of an advocacy group trying to make a change around that front. But I didn't see that changing anytime soon, so I needed to fundraise about $8,000 so that I could go to Ontario to see a private clinic where I could get a double mastectomy. And I managed to fundraise that money by working with local LGBTQ groups, running fundraisers, using my YouTube channel. I created the Fundraise Your Tits Off event, which was this like whole like gallery show of some of the paintings I'd been doing because I was getting into like art and stuff. I finally got the money together. I did my consultation over like Skype with the doctor, and I got my appointment booked 4 months after I started testosterone. The summer of when I was 19, I was going to get top surgery. My family was pretty nervous, even my grandparents. They felt like I was still quite young to be doing all this. But I tried to explain to them, I know I seem young to you, but to me, I have been waiting for my life to begin. And if I can just do this, if I can just medically transition, then I can go to university. I can make friends. I can date. I can just live as myself and not have this hanging over me. So my grandparents, even though they didn't understand, they tried to be there for me. I don't know what my mother was thinking or doing, but my dad, we did meet up right before I left, and he tried to stop me. He told me that I was rushing this, This wasn't something I should be doing with my body. He was extremely disappointed and angry. And I just remember looking at him and being like, we are never going to have a real relationship again. Like, I am never going to forget about how this went. This is not ending my transition, but it is ending any chance we had at a true, authentic relationship with each other ever again. So I did. I went to Ontario. I got my top surgery done. And I stayed with this guy I had met online. He was my own age. He was living with his grandparents. And for 3 weeks, I lived at his house in recovery. We ended up kind of starting a relationship. And when I came back, I told my family I met this guy and I was going to move to Toronto and live with him. My grandparents were terrified for me, but they knew at this point that I was going to do what I wanted to do. So they just helped me plan a safe move out there. They even drove all the way to Ontario to meet his family and make sure that they were safe people to live with. And just before I left Winnipeg for the last time, I said goodbye to all my friends, so the folks at the LGBTQ center, my friends from high school, and I met up with my mother one last time. And I remember I was post-surgery by a few months at this point. I'd been on testosterone for around 6 months. My voice had changed. I looked a little different. And she was sitting down with me, telling me about life at home and my siblings. And I asked, do you think I could see them? And she told me she didn't feel comfortable with that. And I was obviously very disappointed. But that actually wasn't the thing that really set me over the edge. It was that we were sitting at a restaurant and this guy came up to us. And he was one of my parents' friends. And he gave me this hug, which I didn't really want. And I felt him grab my chest as if to check if they were really gone. I felt really gross. This was an adult man grabbing me, whether or not I had anything there. And I realized I didn't feel comfortable telling my mom, or that if she'd seen, she didn't feel comfortable saying what she'd seen. And I realized that this was not somebody who was going to be able to protect me anymore. And maybe that had been the case for a long time. And shortly after that interaction, I got on a bus to Toronto, and I didn't look back. And I knew that my life was finally going to start. And this is the thing, my parents were right. When I moved to Toronto, I didn't really stay with that guy that long. I ended up getting my own place. And I did struggle a lot with poverty, my mental health, finding access to employment, education, connecting with my peers. It was genuinely hard. But even in my most difficult moments, I had this overwhelming sense of relief that I had done it. That thing that all I had been able to think about for my entire life, really, it was finally done. And I had accessed medical transition at an age that so many trans people dream about doing it. 19 years old, and I already had top surgery. I was already on T. Because I was so young, I got certain effects. I was able to get taller. I went from 5'5" to 5'7". I went up a shoe size. And within a year or two on testosterone, I was growing facial hair. My shoulders were broader. And I was passing more or less as male. And I was also then dating gay guys I'd always wanted to do. And yeah, it was tricky. There was a lot of transphobia in the queer community. And I struggled with my housing for sure. There was this one summer where I was just totally without housing. I had gotten kicked out of my crappy rental. And I decided that I wanted to try to couch surf and only stay with other trans people all summer. And I had been sort of racking my brain. Now I'd been on T for a few years and living in trans communities. And I just was asking myself, why does this happen? Why are some of us so driven to live into ourselves? What is even this gender identity thing? Why does it matter so much? And why did I feel I had to give up everything to live into it? Why did I know that I had to do it? And I started asking that question to fellow trans folks. I ended up traveling around Canada and the US all summer 2012. And I asked over 50 trans, two-spirit, and non-binary people, what is gender? What does it mean to you? What is the trans community? And how do we survive together? And I brought all that footage back to Toronto, found myself a room to rent in a little queer collective, and worked with my friend Shane Forrest to turn all that footage into a film. And I ended up getting into Toronto Met University and studying sociology, and realizing what I'd done was this social science project. And using that framework, we launched Mosaic in 2014, which is still on this channel. It was one of the last things I made for YouTube before taking an extended break. And I realized I actually had this huge passion for queer and trans storytelling and social science. And now that I actually knew what I liked and found something that I was good at, I was actually getting great grades, and I was winning like scholarships and awards and funding for my research and connecting with my peers. And I learned that I wanted to be an academic and an author. I ended up writing this like story. At first I made like these zines, like nonfiction zines that I paired with some of like my paintings. But then I got into like fiction writing, and I wrote this story about like Romeo and Julian, but like it was like set in modern day Winnipeg, and I pitched it to a publisher and it got picked up, and I started making these like stories about like queer and trans people falling in love. And I always gave them happy endings because I just feel like we need more happy endings. And it was almost like I was writing to that younger version of myself who was so desperate for representation and like the possibility of joy and love. I met my now husband and we fell in love. And he says one of the first things that attracted him to me was my confidence, because yeah, I was secure in myself. Like, because I got to transition when I did, because I accessed medical transition when I did, I didn't have that weighing over me. I was able to do stuff like write my books, get into grad school, get married, have a kid, and not be like carrying this weight with me all the time. My gender identity has also shifted a little bit since I was like a teenager. When I was younger, I was very fixed on identifying as like male and how that was very important to me. And I like, was a transsexual, changing my sex. And after a few years on T with my like dysphoria lessened and like with a broader understanding of like gender as a social construct and like the variety of ways that you can express yourself, I was like, maybe I'm a little more non-binary. And at this point, I'm just like not attached to labels at all. I'm just very like happy living as myself, and whatever I want to wear, whatever I want to do, I just do that. If I'd had that mindset when I was younger, my transition probably would have been taken a little bit differently. I think there's a lot of people who are like young and non-binary and they get mistaken as like non-serious as a result. I wonder how my family would have reacted if I'd said I was non-binary and not like a trans man. Maybe they would have tolerated that in a different way. But yeah, I'm very, very glad that I accessed transition when I did. And I think it is only because I medically transitioned that I even feel comfortable at all playing with my gender identity or expression. My grandparents, they're just so proud. Both sets, like the minister and the teacher, the nurse, and my other grandmother is a lawyer, like they all are just so proud of me, and they love my husband and our co-parent and our child. They are so excited to like read my books and celebrate them. And all my aunts and uncles and cousins and like extended relatives have come out of the woodwork to support me and lift me up. And honestly, the only people I don't get along with now in the family are my parents. It's not for lack of trying. We have tried to rekindle a couple of times. I do try, like I notified them when we had our kid, and I text one of them occasionally, like pictures and stuff. But I just think like the way we fell apart at that time in my life when I needed them most, I don't know if I'll ever really be able to deeply forgive them for that. I think they thought they were maybe saving me from myself in a way, but all they did was just break us apart in a way that I don't know if we'll ever be healed again. And that is like the great tragedy of my transition story. It's not my identity. It's not even my struggles like my mental health or dysphoria. It's the loss of maybe what could have been. But yeah, I am now a trans person in my 30s. I've been on testosterone for well over a decade. I went off briefly for like my egg retrieval a year or so ago. I thought maybe I wouldn't miss it. I did. I definitely did. And I was excited to get back on. And I am so grateful that now I get to be that older trans person, just like the ones I used to talk to online, who can give that insight of what it's like to go through the process, and that you can come out the other side. And that, in fact, there are so many beautiful aspects of trans community and trans relationships that like I wouldn't trade for the world. And I am thankful that my younger self was able to make the choices that he did, because I don't know if I would have the guts. There was a certain type of like teenage gall and audacity that it took to look my parents in the face and say, you are wrong and you can't stop me, to seek it out at all costs, to sacrifice everything for it, and I get to reap the benefits. So I am so thankful for that younger version of myself, and I'm thankful to you for listening to this story. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I will be posting some new content next week. I think I'm going to try to like switch a little bit of what I'm doing. These long form stories, like they're nice and all, but I personally, like I like to watch a lot of streamers and like gamers. And I was thinking I might do a playthrough of like maybe a video game, maybe like the Tell Me Why game. I think that has a trans protagonist and I haven't played it before. Or maybe Dream Daddies, because I am a romance author and I do love me a little romance. Let me know if you'd like me to make a follow-up video about anything from this conversation, or if you have any ideas for what content you'd like to see from me in the future. I'll see you in a week with another video, and thanks for listening.